The internet's smiling on us now.
That's great.
All right, David, you can.
Hello everyone, sorry about the wait, but I think what we'll be talking about today is definitely worth the wait. My name is David Vogel. I'm a senior communications major here at DePaul. It's my honor to introduce our speaker tonight, who will be presenting over the White House and press relations in the era of Donald Trump. Professor McCall has many specialties, including the media, television, news, First Amendment, freedom of speech, journalism ethics, political communications, the FCC, and the list goes on and on. So if you can't tell, he's got his hands in just about everything. Dr. McCall is an established media critic. He's produced numerous op-eds that have been published in over 100 newspapers across the country, and his mission is to promote media literacy to the public. I first met Dr. McCall when I was a freshman at DePaul when I took his winter term class working for the WGRE radio station. Dr. McCall really sparked my interest in working in the media, and I immediately noticed his passion for working with students. When he's not on the O'Reilly Show, running half marathons, or writing his own book, which is titled Viewer Discretion Advised, Taking Control of Mass Media Influences, which you should go check out, by the way, he's teaching classes and helping DePaul students find their voice at WGRE. I think I've taken every class that Dr. McCall has to offer, and from experience I can say that when he speaks, people stop what they're doing to listen. Not only is Dr. McCall my faculty advisor, but I also consider him a mentor and role model, and I'm excited to see what he has to say tonight. As a part of the Office of Alumni Engagement Virtual Alumni College Webinar Series, please welcome Dr. Jeff McCall.
Thanks, David. I appreciate it. And thanks to Amanda for helping getting things coordinated here tonight. For those of you here in the audience at the Watson Forum or watching over our webcast, you can see why it's so fun to work at DePaul and work with students like David and some of the other students who are here tonight, and I really appreciate that. And I appreciate the Alumni Office for getting me on the road from time to talk to different alumni groups, because that's always a great opportunity to see DePaul alums who still have a lot of affection for this institution, and as certainly I do as well. I graduated in 1976, and maybe we have a couple people out there from that 1970s era who are with us today. As David mentioned, my academic mission in my career has been to promote media literacy. My sense is that our citizenry doesn't understand the impact the media have on society, and I think we need to work harder to make sure that people are, in this day and age, media literate, which means they can understand the impact that the media have on us on all kinds of levels. And one level, frankly, has been in recent days, we've been talking about how violent content in the media impacts our culture and our society, particularly in the aftermath of school shootings in recent weeks. And I think if people understood the impact of the media more, it would make it easier for people to manage their media consumption and perhaps demand better out of the media producers that are out there. But ideas get disseminated through the media, and I've tried to work in the classroom, obviously, but also, as David mentioned, my book, thanks for the plug. But I started writing op-ed columns with an idea to take media literacy and media analysis to regular people out there and not just other academics, because there was a time in my career where I was writing stuff for other academics or going to conferences and presenting in academic context, which is all great, and convention papers are great, and journal articles are great, but there's a point where I think all faculty should try to reach out and take what they know to the citizenry. There was a great article a couple of years ago in the New York Times by Nicholas Kristof, a columnist, and the title of the column he wrote was "Professors, We Need You," and the whole point was to try to get professors to talk to people outside of the ivory tower. So I've been, working to do that. Anyway, let's fasten our seatbelts here and talk a little bit about how Trump impacts the news media in this day and age, what that has meant for media consumers who are trying to get news. The press and Donald Trump have had an antagonistic relationship, as you might figure. You could, and some people blame the media for that, other people blame Trump for that. Personally, I blame both sides. Kind of takes two to argue in a sense like that. But I think I will start out with a quiz, and for the people watching us virtually, it'd be hard to participate. But the quiz for the people in our audience here is to answer this question: how much of the news is fake? How much of the news is fake? Do you think maybe a fourth of all the news is fake, or a third of all the news is fake, or maybe half of the news is fake? Amanda says half. Anybody with another guess? Okay. Several people talking 10 to 20% in the audience, but anyway, here's my answer. Okay? All the news is fake. Okay? All the news is fake. And the reason I say that is because the news is actually a concoction of whatever producers and editors decide is news, all right? And all that the news producers and editors decide is news is filtered through their attitudes, their predispositions, their beliefs, their value structures, right? So it's really impossible for any news producer or editor, no matter how well-intentioned they are, to give us a 100% accurate portrait of reality. Okay, so let's think about that for a second. You know, there was a media theorist at the University of Iowa for a long time named Sam Becker, and he used to explain this notion that, you know, news is a created commodity, because the parallel he would give is to say the map is not the territory. So if I were to hold like up a map of the state of Indiana, well, that's not the state of Indiana, it's a representation of the state of Indiana. And that's what Becker would say is, when we're doing the news, we are not exactly capturing an event that happened. You know, Trump inspecting a border wall in Southern California today. We are talking about it with words, maybe showing little snippets of video, talking to an analyst maybe who was reflecting on Trump having visited a border wall or whatever, okay? But the bottom line then becomes, it's a creation, right? So I think that's one thing for media news consumers to keep in mind, is that everything they see in the news is filtered through a lot of predispositions and attitudes. And that's not to say that all news is 100%, you know, warped. But I think it does mean that we need to look at news being presented to us as kind of on a continuum where it's impossible to have it be 100% reality. But on the other hand, we don't want our news to be totally fiction either, you know, where we're chasing unicorns out here. So news sometimes comes on a continuum where it's maybe a little closer to reality and more fact-based and more accurate, versus stuff that is just completely harebrained and out there. Right? So keep in mind that continuum, because I think that's important. Now, not only do we need to talk about individual news stories as whether they're fake or not, I think we also need to think about the news agenda, whether that's an accurate perception of what's really happening in the world as well. Because you could look at an individual story and say, is this accurate? Is it fact-based? Is it pretty close to the reality? Or is it chasing unicorns over here? But I also think we need to look at the whole news agenda, which is all the stories that end up in the news media, all right? And here's an example, I think, that kind of helps demonstrate to us really how subjective that news agenda making really is in terms of deciding what goes in the news. Because that's a big factor in terms of whether news is fair or accurate or objective, is which stories are we deciding to put in. As news producers for television talk about the news hole. They look at a news hole and you fill it up, okay? But just for example, on March 5th, okay, you might remember, that was the day that the former Trump campaign aide named Sam Nunberg decided to go around and start talking to various cable channels, okay? Some people think Sam Nunberg's a little bit out there. Who am I to criticize? But nonetheless, on the day Sam Nunberg went out to start talking to news reporters, CNN, over an 8-hour period of time from late afternoon until 11 at night, spent 75% of all CNN airtime over an 8-hour period was spent talking about and rehashing and replaying, and in fact, in some cases, interviewing live, Sam Nunberg. Okay? Well, I'm not saying Sam Nunberg didn't make news that day because he was basically taunting the special investigator and stuff like that. But on the other hand, that means that there's not much else going on in the world on that particular day. So, I mean, in a sense, you could look at CNN as having helped create a fake news agenda that day by over-exaggerating or overemphasizing the importance of Sam Nunberg, who since that day has kind of drifted off the news agenda, right? So how could he be worth 75% of airtime over 8 hours, and 8 days later, he's not in the news at all? All right? So I find that weird. So think about the news in terms of emphases on stories, the news in terms of what goes into that news agenda. Those news stories are chosen by people. They are chosen by human beings with their own predispositions. As it turns out in the United States, most of the people doing that news choosing live in a particular geographic area of the country, most of them in New York or Washington. Many of them went to the same colleges or journalism schools. They hang out together, right? So the news agenda may be getting shaped as much by the mindsets of small little cores of editors and producers in one geographic area of the country than maybe would be beneficial for the news agenda of the whole nation. And I find this interesting too, because, you know, what goes into that news hole that we talked about? We had a tragic shooting in Florida at a school. 17 people died. And that has filled the news agenda for days. And it's still part of the news agenda. And in fact, this week, when there are school walkouts planned and demonstration, that's going to be part of the news agenda again, and people talking about gun control legislation and whatnot. Okay. A big school district near an urban area in Florida gets a lot of news attention. You might remember in January, there was a school shooting in western Kentucky. Now, not as many students died. I believe it was 3 or 4. But that was a story for only 3 or 4 hours. In fact, the big 3 cable channels on the day of that school shooting in Kentucky, which could have been much more disastrous, okay, I mean, that could have been at the nature or the magnitude of the Florida school shooting. It wasn't, thankfully. But the big 3 cable channels that night of the of the Kentucky school shooting, the big 3 cable channels, CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News combined spent 16 minutes talking about that Kentucky school shooting. And I guess my question is, why is that school shooting where people died in Kentucky not useful, you know, in terms of news coverage in the same way that a Florida school shooting was? So there's real power in determining what goes into that agenda. Walter Cronkite, the legendary CBS newsman, used to say that it was the challenge of the news industry to hold up the mirror to reality and to society for them to look in and see the news reflected back at them. But we know that that's really not possible. Now, Trump has chosen to challenge the media in ways that other administrations have not over the years. And I think that it's worth us kind of looking at what that means for our society and what that means in terms of creating a news agenda of substance that looks at the real stories and puts the Trump administration in perspective, but also allows us to put into perspective all the kinds of other stories other than Trump that maybe need to be covered as well. As some of my students in the audience know, I like to quote a socio-political philosopher from the 20th century named G.K. Chesterton. And Chesterton, I think, was a very brilliant guy and an underappreciated philosopher. I'll put in a plug for him, okay? But Chesterton was a journalist at the time in his career, amongst his very many writing skills. But in one of his commentaries about the product of journalism, he wrote, and I think this is a great quote from G.K. Chesterton, it said, "People know in their hearts that journalism is a conventional art like any other, that it selects, heightens, and falsifies. Its nemesis is the same as that of all the other arts. If it loses all care for the truth, it loses all form likewise. So Chesterton, as a journalist himself, was reflecting and saying, really, the whole point of journalism is at some point to select and heighten, and indeed, as he said, falsifies. Let's get a little bit more into talking about presidential relations with the media. Here's a quote I love to read. You'll excuse me, I'll need my glasses for this. This is a quote from a former United States president. During the course of this administration, and in order to disturb it, the artillery of the press has been leveled against us, charged with whatsoever its licentiousness could devise or dare. These abuses of an institution, the press, so important to freedom, are deeply to be regretted inasmuch as they tend to lessen its usefulness and to sap its safety. That president went on then to complain about false facts reported by the press and that the press engages in improprieties. Now, that language is a little more dignified than what we hear from Trump, but it's clear that that was a president who had it in for the press, who did not like the press. When you talk about the level, the artillery being leveled against us. That is a quote, and people are always shocked to hear this, that is a quote from the second inaugural address of Thomas Jefferson. Okay? Thomas Jefferson, the same guy who at one point in his early political career said he'd rather have newspapers without a government than a government without newspapers. And this is a guy who, by the time he'd been president for 4 years, was ready to give up on the press and to attack them, as you might figure. So he had it. The press was reporting about his social life, as some of you might know the history, but also they were reporting about his political decisions, and he was ready to be done with them. Throughout U.S. history, many presidents have feuded with the press. Truman didn't like the press, and we are concerned now about Donald Trump has a foul mouth and uses profane or vulgar expressions. Harry Truman knew how to cuss too, by the way. Okay, Lyndon Johnson, famously profane and hated the media, and not above challenging them when he saw them in person. Richard Nixon, of course, hated the press, had members of the press on his enemies list that he kept in the Oval Office. He sent out Spiro Agnew, the vice president at that time, who referred to the press as nattering nabobs of negativism. And that was shocking to the press at that time, that a member of the Nixon administration would go forward and publicly scold them like he did. But it's also worth noting, I think, too, that President Obama was treated pretty well by most accounts by the media, but even President Obama was not necessarily friendly to the press, and I think this is worth noting. The Obama administration was very unfriendly to the press in terms of freedom of information requests. During the Obama administration, you had surveillance of various reporters, including the Associated Press, CBS's Cheryl Atkinson, Fox News Channel's James Rosen were surveilled. Now, did that happen directly with President Obama ordering it? Probably not, but it was part of his administration that easily could have stopped. And interestingly, the Society of Professional Journalists, which was founded here at DePaul University, of course, headed up a group of about 30 to 35 press organizations and media companies that sent a letter to the White House midway through the Obama administration, vehemently protesting the Obama administration's laxity in meeting freedom of information requests and their inability to cooperate and be transparent with the members of the media. President Obama, while president, publicly scolded Fox News Channel 8 or 9 times. He also attacked talk radio as being adversarial to his administration. That might be true to a large extent, but all I'm saying here is that it's not uncommon throughout the history of the United States for presidents to go after the media. And the Exhibit A for all of this, as some of you students who had media law remember, John Adams, when he was president, signed the Sedition Acts into law, which made it a crime to criticize the federal government. And during the Adams administration, journalists literally were jailed for criticizing the Adams administration. Having said all that, Trump takes it all to a new level, right? He's taken a flamethrower to the press. He's referred to the press as the enemy of the people. He's referred to the press as sick people, as the most dishonest people in the nation. Last weekend in Pennsylvania at a campaign-style rally, President Trump beat up the media, calling him sick, and he called NBC's Chuck Todd, am I allowed to say this? He called Chuck Todd a son of a bitch in public at a campaign rally. By the way, Chuck Todd can handle that, I'm sure. And interestingly, during the first year of Trump's administration, and the Columbia Journalism Review tracked this, during the year 2017, Trump handed out 993 tweets that bashed the media. I'm thinking that's a lot of tweeting for anybody, but let alone a president who has presumably other things to be doing. But 993 tweets bashing the media during the first year of the Trump administration. And by the way, that was more tweeting about the media than about any other topic. So isn't that interesting to think that you're president of the United States and you tweet to bash the media more than you tweet to talk about the economy or international affairs or White House policy or anything else for that matter, okay? Now, a lot of times when I talk to folks, the concern is raised that Trump's bashing of the media has ruined the media's credibility, right? I don't think it has helped the media's credibility. Interestingly, if you follow some of the surveying, media credibility has maybe taken a little bump up in the last year, maybe because Trump's gone after them, I don't know. But people need to keep in mind that the decline in media trust, okay, the decline in public credibility toward the media has been happening for over 15 years. If you go back and you look at Gallup and you look at Pew Research Center and you look at the Knight Ridder Foundation studies of media credibility, there has been a steady decline in media trust for over 15 years. So Trump did not cause media credibility to decline. And long before Trump came down the escalator to run for president, media credibility was already in trouble. Okay, now, Trump certainly has exploited that distrust, and I certainly believe that Trump has exploited that media distrust for his own political purposes. And I'm convinced that he believes that he would not have won the election had he not used the media as, a bashing implement, okay? So, I mean, you think about that. So people ask me sometimes, well, will Trump come around? He'll start moderating his feeling on the media. I don't think so, because I think he figures that helped him win the election and maybe even helps him govern. And here's the thing. Trump, whether you think this is a good idea or not, he painted the press as part of the establishment. He painted the press as part of the establishment and part of the swamp that needed to be drained. And so it figures that he would attack the press like he would attack other parts of the Washington establishment that he thinks that needs to be drained. There is a concern that by Trump bashing the media that somehow he is chilling the free press, that he is disrupting the ability of the press to do its job, its constitutional job, supported by the First Amendment. It is worth keeping in mind, of course, that Trump, as an American citizen, has his own First Amendment rights to bash the media as he wants to. Right? I'm not saying that's a good idea, but he certainly does have that. And if any of you have read my columns, you know that I have written in places like The Hill and the Indianapolis Star that I think Trump's attack on the media are boorish, they're unnecessary, they're a distraction, they're not proper decorum for any number of reasons, okay? But having said all that, we need to keep in mind the press is stronger than what people give it credit for. People think, oh, Trump's beating up the media, the poor media. The press is strong. The First Amendment is very strong. Freedom of the press is not going to go away because Donald Trump criticized NBC at a campaign rally in Pennsylvania. Think about this. CNN is still very aggressively reporting on Donald Trump. The Washington Post is still very aggressively reporting on Donald Trump, as is the New York Times, as is NBC. None of those news organizations are backing off their criticism of of Trump or their news coverage of Trump just because they think he's going to beat him up in a tweet or yell at him at a campaign rally. And I think that's one thing people need to keep in mind. The First Amendment is very strong. The freedom of the press is very strong. And keep in mind also that we've got a Supreme Court that will maintain freedom of the press and the opportunities that the First Amendment provides there. The Roberts Court has been very strong in advocating for First Amendment protections across the board. An NYU law professor named Bert Newborn wrote that the Roberts Supreme Court is perhaps the strongest First Amendment court in history, that they've really stopped all efforts by any government efforts to stop the flow of information. A law professor at St. Louis University, Chad Flanders, wrote that the Supreme Court, as we currently have it, is almost absolutist in favor of keeping free speech, free press privileges out there. So when people say that, oh, Trump's going to change libel laws because, people criticize him and he wants to make it easier for public figures, to sue the media, that's not going to happen. Trump threatened the licenses of NBC television stations last year. And immediately, the chairman of the FCC, Ajit Pai, said, that's not going to happen, okay? The licenses are not going to be changed because, well, the president doesn't have the authority to do that. So when I got calls from reporters like, oh, do you think Trump's going to get the NBC licenses yanked because he doesn't like NBC? And I said, not a chance. And he can't, okay? And, Trump wants to win in the court of public opinion. He can't win in the real legal courtroom. So when he threatens about libel laws, he threatens about licenses. Even recently, we've heard stories that Trump lawyers are going to try to file an injunction to stop CBS from broadcasting the interview they did with Stormy Daniels. Okay? Probably some of you are really eager to see an interview with Stormy Daniels, but nonetheless, there's been a thought that Trump is going to try to file an injunction to stop that interview from happening. That's not going to happen. Just this week in media law class, I just went to class and I said, hey, there's talk out there that the Trump attorneys are going to try to stop the CBS interview of Stormy Daniels. I said, what do you think about that? Not one student in the class thought there was any chance at all of that happening. And that's because they've read their textbook, but also they pay attention. But they know that with all the precedents against government prior restraint, they know that could not happen. So when people get their hair on fire, like, oh no, Trump's going to file an injunction and stop the Stormy Daniels interview, it's kind of like, don't worry about that. So that's one thing I always tell folks. Trump fights the media fights Trump, fine. But Trump is not going to diminish the First Amendment. He's not going to diminish the free press. The free press, if anything, will fight back harder at the threat that they are under, and they will be just fine. Now, having said all this, I think it is worth us thinking for a second here about why is media credibility in decline? All right? I don't think Trump is the reason. He's not going to help rebuild it, obviously. But I think we need to think about what kind of introspection the press should be doing to get a sense of why their credibility is being questioned by rank and file Americans around the country. And I think, frankly, the media needs to do a scouting report on itself. They need to look at themselves. Like, hey, we've got a constitutional role, we're important, we want to do hard-hitting journalism. Why is it that audiences are turning up their noses at us? And part of the thing is they need to look for more balance. They really do need to look for balance in their reporting. They also need to make a point to separate fact-based reporting from opinion and analysis. And one thing I hear when I talk to citizens here in Indiana, They're concerned that opinion and analysis and editorializing has drifted into what is supposed to be hard news. And that's more of a problem for the press than whether Trump yells at that. So the press should look at itself. They should go where the facts lead. And they should cover Trump stories as aggressively if they can. Trump does generate fiction. Trump does generate antagonism, right? Cover that and tell us what the facts are, but don't get into a lot of speculation. One of the things I like to talk about here in terms of facts, because people always say, well, let's report more facts. You need to keep in mind here, and this comes from some of you alums, you might remember Professor Robert Weiss, legendary DePaul communication professor and championship debate coach, used to always say, facts don't speak for themselves. People do. Right? Keep that in mind. Facts don't speak for themselves. We make decisions as to which facts get presented and how to interpret those facts. So reporters need to focus more on reporting facts, but also giving healthy analysis and interpretation of those. And this is one of those things where, even though Trump does generate antagonism, let's look at that overall news agenda. The Media Research Center, which is based in suburban Washington. Now, by the way, the Media Research Center is a right-leaning organization. I've been out to visit them because I look at their data and I'm curious as to how they get it. And I went out there a couple of years ago and met with some of their people and talked to their researchers. People might disagree with their view of the world, but I think when you look at the data they're generating, I think that's pretty fair and accurate. They've got professional researchers whose reputations are on the line. Okay, so when they're doing content analyses, I think we can look at the facts that they're generating, the research they're generating, and then try to assess those, but I don't know that we need to question that their political motivations have tainted their data. But nonetheless, the Media Research Center said that last year, 2017, in the big three evening newscasts, ABC, NBC, and CBS, of those big three, 90% of all stories about Trump were negative. 90% of all stories about Trump were negative in the big three major newscasts of the networks. All right, now, I know Trump generates a lot of negative news, but is it a 90-10 balance? And that's where I think your audiences get confused. If you look at the American viewing public, news consumers, and you figure, okay, maybe roughly a third of them lean right, maybe a third of them lean left, and you've got the other people kind of the moderate central part of things, okay? For the people who see 90% of Trump coverage as negative, you're probably really making the third that lean left happy. But for everybody else, they might like, is this necessarily fair, okay? By the way, that data from the Media Research Center has been confirmed by research studies at the Pew Research Center, which is not a partisan organization at all, and by the Shorenstein Center of the Press at Harvard as well. And my point here about this 90%, 10% balance problem, or imbalance maybe, is that this fuels the narrative of a lot of the people who think that the media is trying to take sides and that the media is trying to push agendas and that they're not really trying to report the news fairly. And I think that's a particular problem because that fuels what is referred to in media theory cycles as the hostile media cycle. This hostile media phenomenon is a notion that you always think that the media is out to get your side, whoever that is. But also think about self-inflicted errors by the media that cause members of the public to be concerned. Just in a 7-day stretch in December of 2017, ABC's Brian Ross reported inaccurately about what he thought was upcoming testimony from Michael Flynn. And you might remember that on the day he reported that Michael Flynn was going to admit to Russian collusion, that the stock market tanked. Okay, so think about this. Inaccurate reporting had a ripple effect into the markets. But also that same week, in a 7-day stretch, you had ABC Brian Ross with an inaccurate report. You had Bloomberg News saying that there had been a subpoena issued for Trump finances. that turned out not to be true either. And CNN reported on Donald Trump Jr. In a report that turned out to be false. And that's part of the problem that the media faces now, is that they make mistakes, they're self-inflicted, and that causes them more damage in the eyes of the American public than anything Trump does. Think about this. Gallup and Knight combined on a national survey last year, the Knight Foundation and the Gallup polling organization, and they determined that half of all Americans say that the media is doing a poor job of supporting democracy. Okay, half of all Americans say that the media is doing a poor job of supporting democracy. The causes: deadline pressure, weak sourcing. Think of how many stories you see in the news these days where they say an unnamed source. All right? I know unnamed sources, background sources are essential to a lot of reporting, sometimes even with student media here at DePaul, right? But you don't want to make a living off of that. And at a certain point, you need to have sources on the record or multiple sources to confirm things. We already talked a little bit about the importance of making sure opinion and fact reporting is segregated and separated, because we don't want to confuse the audience with hard-hitting news reporting versus antagonistic editorializing. And I watched Good Morning America earlier this week, and over a several-minute span, they were talking about things in the Trump White House. I lost track of the number of times I heard the Good Morning America reporters saying, well, if this is true, or it might have happened, or it could be the case. And I'm thinking, why are you speculating on any of this stuff? Report what you know, and let's not have a lineage of could, might, maybe, should, if reporting that was actually all negative about Trump. So if Trump's up at 7 in the morning watching Good Morning America, it's no wonder he's probably getting ready to tweet. By the way, none of this is designed to defend Trump or to make him a victim. I don't think the press should take it easy on him. I critique the media, and it matters very little to me if Trump hates the press, but it does matter a lot to me if the public gives up on the press. And I think that's where we're headed here, is that we're going to end up with the public giving up on the press, and I don't think that's healthy necessarily. So let me wrap up here and say we need to be concerned here about whether the media is a help or a hindrance in terms of helping us understand a complicated world. And as I like to tell students, you at a certain point need to be your own editor. You need to search out your information from multiple sources, and you need to apply the sniff test. People talk about fake news floating around on social media. You know, if you're on social media and you're on Facebook or Twitter or whatever, and you see something about, the Martians are invading New Jersey, your sniffer should just kick in and that's maybe not true. And I also tell people, if you see something and it seems like it might be a little hard to figure out, go check some other sources and see if you can verify. And if you can't, then maybe the first story you heard is maybe a little bit out. So basically, what people all need to do when they're consuming the news is news consumers, particularly you DePaul alums out there, need to apply the same critical thinking skills to the news that you learned while you were a student at DePaul University. And that's where I think liberally arts-educated people can really make a difference in their own lives, but also the lives of the other citizens that they interact with. And that's why we need liberal arts institutions to help give people those sniff detectors. So anyway, and I understand from Amanda that people have provided us with some questions, so
Yes, thank you.
I'm eager to hear from those.
And thank you to the alumni viewing online and to the people we have here in Watson Forum. Like he said, I'm Amanda Falkenberg. I'm the Director of Alumni Engagement for campus and regional events. We do have a few questions that came in online, so I'll go ahead and get started with some of those, but we're happy to take questions from the crowd too. You covered a lot of this just in your talk, as we assumed you would, and several of them relate to each other, so I'm actually going to kind of read two at one time and have you answer them together. So the first one is from Craig Stokely, the class of 1967, and he asks, who invented the term fake news? What is it? And how has it affected reporting in today's world? And then related, Dave Felling, the class of 1982, asks, for years, critics have complained that TV news, both local and network, neglected reporting on serious issues in favor of domestic crime and gotcha investigations. Has this made it easier for viewers to believe charges that what they see from mainstream TV news is fake?
A lot in there. Dave Failing, of course, professional newsman himself for many years, so he would probably be in a better position to answer that question than I am. Dave hit on something really important in terms of the news agenda, though, and that is the news agenda of today is much softer and more sensational than it would have been 20, 30 years ago. And there are a number of stories out there from Shorenstein and places like that to demonstrate that. His concern about, police coverage in news and that sort of thing is legitimate as well. And also, I think all those things contribute to a decline in media credibility as well. I think the latest data is that roughly a third of all news in local television, so I'm not talking about the networks here, although the networks are partly to blame for that, but more so local television, so what you'd see on TV. I think Dave used to live in Houston, but Houston or Indianapolis, that a third of all the news coverage is what is referred to as cop shop news. Shootings, holdups, arrests, brawls, car wrecks, emergency runs of the fire department, that kind of stuff, cop shop. Frankly, one of the reasons I think there's so much cop shop news is because in every big city they've got it. You can usually go live in the evening to the scene of a crime, and it's easy. You can cover it with a template or a formula. You don't have to go look for it because it's there all the time, and doesn't take any enterprise. You show up on the scene, there's a crime, you report your template, this happened, this was a victim, this was a cause, a suspect in custody, and go on about it. And doing enterprise reporting or in-depth reporting of key issues is much tougher. And I am concerned that local news, but even at the network level, that we're not doing enough news of what we call high impact, of things that affect a wide range of people, that we're more interested in sensational or thrilling kinds of stories that might be exciting for a short term or lend themselves to good video. Think of how many stories get on the air just because there's weird video. It drives me crazy when I see news stories that are just based on a YouTube video that some weird guy put on, okay? Now, getting back to the whole notion of fake news, I think fake news has been a problem for years. But I think it's more in discussion now because I think we are concerned about how many things float through the internet, and there are no filters out there. I mean, there was a time when if all your news came from your daily newspaper or maybe a news magazine or a network news outlet, that you knew that that information had been gathered by a reporter, gone through an editor or a news writer, a producer, maybe an executive producer, or at a newspaper, several layers of, copy editors and managing editors before it ever got out there, all right? So, I mean, I think, whereas we might have had fake news for a long time, it didn't just get into the mainstream like it does now, because anybody can put stuff out there on a blog, or anybody can post stuff on social media, and it gets out there and starts getting traction. And even these news aggregator sites, people who just go in and pull news stories from different places, they're looking for stuff that's going to get the most clicks. And so they're more likely to put the Martians invading New Jersey as opposed to some sort of policy, subtle economic thing that might glaze over people's eyes. So I think the loss of editorial filters, the prevalence of social media and the internet has contributed a lot to that. But that's where we need to get our sniff detectors out.
And then I'll do two more, and then we'll take some from the crowd for a minute. Both of these have to do with objectivity by the press. So Robert Dinsford, class of 1961, has asked, when and why do you think that much of the press has lost its objectivity when it comes to the presidency, and specifically President Trump? And then Jim Cerrone, class of 1986, asked, is unbiased, objective media with strong journalistic ethics finished?
I'd like to think it's not finished. But I do think the media needs to pay more attention to how they present their product. And we talked a little bit already about separating fact from opinion. And fairness is a skill. That's a phrase I like to take to my electronic journalism class. Fairness is a skill. I didn't make up that phrase. I actually heard that first by the former ABC White House correspondent and then later Fox News anchor Brit Hume. Brit Hume, a legendary figure in Washington, D.C. Reporting circles. He was once at a program where he said, fairness is a skill, and it takes work. And it takes concerted effort to be fair. And I must say, I think we've gone into an era where reporters maybe don't feel the compelling drive to be as fair. And let me reflect on that in a couple ways. There was a political writer in the 20th century named Walter Lippmann. And one of his great quotes, I think, is, "Where all think alike, no one thinks very much." And I think we see that kind of groupthink in many of the newsrooms now of today, okay? There's plenty of data out there to show that people who work in professional journalism, particularly in the East Coast-based newsrooms, they tend to hang out together, they tend to think certain ways, they're more likely to vote certain ways in polling that they've done of these folks. And I think it's going to take an extra effort on those folks to say, I maybe have my own political beliefs, I maybe hang around people who have certain political beliefs, but I need to find a way to be fair, and that has to take a certain kind of determination, but also an understanding of what makes for fair. We talk in class sometimes here about, this sounds kind of stuffy, but psycholinguistic objectivity. Does that ring a bell? Okay. Well, you can go in and analyze word choices. Which ones are more fair? Which ones are not? Which pseudo-quantify? Which ones actually quantify? Okay. Which are concept words? Which are function words? And I think we need more of that kind of wordsmithing. And again, I'm not in the trenches doing the deadline reporting. That's very hard to do, by the way. I'm very sympathetic to the media. It's a very tough job. I had a short media career as a reporter. I made plenty of mistakes. And I know it's not easy to write on deadline and to try to get a lot of facts, sometimes from competing interests. But there is a point where you have to sit down and really conscientiously say, is this as accurate and fair, and have I removed myself from that? And this is an anecdote, but after the election in 2016, there are anecdotes coming out of some of the newsrooms on the East Coast where people were shocked that Trump had won. Well, a lot of people were shocked that Trump had won. But in this one particular anecdote, a reporter said, I can't believe Trump won. I don't know anybody who would have voted for him. I'm thinking, okay, well, let's just say you don't know anybody who would have voted for him. Are you able to get out of that kind of little box you're in and think, well, maybe there are people who did vote for him, and what are their interests, and why did they vote for him? And in the news coverage of him, Trump, are we looking at why people still support him? I mean, you know, it has been a rather chaotic White House on many levels, but is it 90% negative and only 10% positive, or is there somewhere else in between? By the way, it is worth noting that if you look at rogue nations, okay, where the media is controlled, you know, you have 100% positive news coverage of despots, all right, and, you know, dictators, all right? That's probably not good for those citizens or those nations. And when we're 90-10, does that kind of move us in a direction now that's it's antagonistic to our administration? But even then, it's not necessarily good to have opposition, the press be considered part of the opposition, okay? And also getting back to what we talked about in terms of press freedoms, keep in mind, as much as Trump has beaten up the media is still functioning, and that there are nations around the world where reporters still are being jailed. You know, Egypt, Turkey, places like that. Reporters get arrested for criticizing the government, and we're not there yet. But I do think reporters are going to have to get outside of their boxes. They're going to have to talk to some folks who are not like them and get out of this mindset of where all think alike, no one thinks very much, because they need to think more. It's going to take a while to win back public trust in the media.
Does anyone have Any questions? So there's a follow-up to something you mentioned earlier in your presentation and in your answer just now. This is from C.J. Johnston, class of 1983. It's kind of lengthy. Study after study shows that most national/legacy media members support the left. It's a foundational reason this current president receives such overwhelmingly negative coverage, and he cites the same Pew study that we mentioned earlier. As well, university studies show that faculty and administration are often more left-leaning. That means that generations of writers, reporters, and journalism students get scant exposure to moderate and conservative thoughts and voices, further feeding this national bias. Question: should undergraduate and graduate, especially journalism schools, faculty be overhired in the future toward a more conservative weighting? Or any other ideas for bringing more balance into the curriculum?
That's a great question. I guess my feeling is that when universities hire faculty, they should always be looking for the brightest people to come in and the most effective teachers and scholars. And I would think if we do that, you will end up with a broader range of points of view. But again, that takes effort too, to make sure that the people who are on search committees in academia and in newsrooms, that they're not hiring people who are always just like them. There really is an advantage to having intellectual diversity in college classrooms, intellectual diversity in newsrooms, because we really need a broad range of perspectives, and the news media is not immune from the kind of cultural struggles that we see around the country. But the media suffers credibility decline when they can't reach broad sections of the population. And I think that's part of their concern here. And this is interesting. You know, when elections are over and the polling is done of people who voted, and they are asked, who did the media most support during the run-up to the election in terms of news coverage? In most cases, this was true when President Obama was elected, and this was true even when President Trump was elected. Most citizens acknowledged that the press sided with the Democratic candidate. And that includes, of course, a number of Hillary supporters who acknowledged that the press was more sympathetic to Hillary in the run-up to the election than Trump. If her supporters acknowledge that, you'd really like for the voters to be able to say, I didn't see that the press was supporting either candidate. I felt like we were getting a fair shake of where the candidates stood on the issues and what their strengths were and their weaknesses, and they couldn't tell. And I would dare say that going back into the 60s and 50s, when you looked at Howard K. Smith and you looked at Walter Cronkite and David Brinkley, that there was a time when your news consumers watching those legendary newscasters would not have been able to tell their leanings. But now, my guess is when you tune in most newscasts, you can probably get a pretty good sense of where those news anchors are. Now, maybe not so much on the local level, but on the national level, that might be true.
We've got a few more questions here, and then I'll check the online form.
Okay.
So, Jason Kistler, class of 1994.
Hi, Jason.
Several news outlets have knowingly and blatantly published false stories. What consequences should befall these individuals and their editors who allow these stories to run?
It's got to come from public disdain. There's really nothing that any law or public official could or should do to them. You know, we have a First Amendment. The First Amendment allows for the press to report falsehoods. There's nothing illegal about that. That's a bummer, but that's where I think, by the way, I think that's good. Because, I mean, if the government were making decisions as to what's false and what not, you end up with Baghdad Bob, if people remember him. He was a propaganda minister for Saddam Hussein who, you know, blurted out all kinds of crazy stuff and suppressed stuff that was antagonistic to the Saddam Hussein regime. But where we find, though, that news organizations are publishing, releasing things that later turn out to be false. I think the public needs to turn their back, tune in another place, click another place, read online a different place. That's the only thing that's eventually going to get the press in line, is when the financial models or the financial pressures make it so tough on them to be wrong that they will lose traffic. By the way, to a certain extent, that has happened with Breitbart, the right-leaning website. Their traffic, their clicks declined over a period of months because they got off into some areas that scared away the number of their people. So it's going to take financial pressure and public pressure to make that happen. But that's a great question.
And then finally, Karen Carlson, class of 1979, she mentioned a New York Times article that she submitted by Farhad Manjoo. It was titled, "For 2 months, I got my news from print newspapers, and here's what I learned." This article mentions the virtues of print versus online media, especially when it comes to the issue of false reporting and the speed at which things are put out. He argues that print media actually does a better job because it takes a little bit longer to get out. They have time to collect the facts. So what do you think about that?
Well, I mentioned earlier, deadline pressure has created a lot of the mistakes in the news industry, and it has created a lot of the credibility problems in the news industry because people are so intent on getting things out quickly. You know, if it were up to me, and I know I sound like an old fogey when I say this, but if it were up to me, people would still get more of their news from holding a newspaper in their hand. Because the one thing we know about a newspaper is that there's a delay between when it, you know, the stories get crafted and when they end up being actually delivered out there. And sometimes that slower process allows for better incubation of news and less emotion and more verification. And another reason for why reading newspapers with, you know, a hard copy in your hand is better is there's all kinds of evidence that shows that people who hold a hard copy of anything in their hand will get more out of it, will read it longer and read it in more depth, where people who are getting stuff online, whether it's, you know, a desktop computer or an iPad or a cellular phone, they skim through and cruise through things a lot faster, which also then leads to more people misconstruing the main point of the stories. Because that's one thing. We talk about fake news. There could be a lot of news that's actually fair, that is accurate, but you skim through it so fast, you get the wrong impression, you don't catch the right word, or you don't get the right context. You're left thinking that the story was about something than what it was. TV news is famous for that. TV news is famous that people watch TV, you know, they see 15 seconds of a story that's a minute and a half, and they jump to conclusions based on a couple of pictures they've seen, and they didn't listen to the script, and they didn't hear the context that might come later. So I would always be, if I were a news consumer like some of our listeners out there now, I'd say go to the slow mediums. Go to the ones that took more time to process and to get into place, as opposed to the stuff that's just lobbed onto the internet or through social media as fast as they can.
Well, if we don't have any more questions here, I think we're out. There's nothing on the form.
Okay, great.
So I'd like to thank Dr. McCall.
Thank you for having me.
Joining us this evening. Thank everyone that's watching online and also everyone who joined us here. We appreciate your joining us.
It's great to be with you. Thanks.